Welcome to Tate Modern. I'm Emily Pringle, Head of Learning, Practice and Research here at Tate, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you to this event, which started, as these things do, in a conversation between Anna, myself and Leslie, and has ended up here, which is fantastic. I think we all feel that this is a subject very close to our hearts and of real urgency. And I think my only sort of hope for this afternoon is we've got this fantastic lineup of people who are going to give provocations, and then lots of opportunity for debate and discussion. And then at the end, we're going to have a kind of feedback session. And as I said, my sort of wish for today is that we have a really robust conversation and focus on possibly issues that we don't normally get to talk about, or talk about them in a way that we don't necessarily talk about. So a focus on the kind of what can we do differently, what are we frustrated about, of which there is so much, but what can we do to change that, is my hope for this afternoon. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Leslie.
Thanks, Emily, and a very warm welcome from NSCAD, and we're delighted to be here today working in partnership with our Tate colleagues. And I think, as many of you will know, in 2016 we published our survey report, and we asked the question, in the last 5 years, how has government policy impacted on art, craft and design education? The findings were, for us, predictable, and for the education and cultural sector, very disappointing. And I know you've all seen the report, and there are copies of the report on the table. But I'm not going to labour on the negatives. Today is about positivity. The survey was welcomed, for want of a better word, and circulated widely across the education and cultural sectors. I was invited to present the findings of the survey report at the Expert Group for Cultural Education hosted by the Arts Council. Present at the meeting was Anna Cutler, Director of Learning at the Tate, who immediately wanted to respond. I met with Anna and Emily Pringle, and this event was devised. The survey asked the question, what will art, craft and design education look like in 2020? Well, what will it look like? And that's what we're asking you to consider today. And I hope you have a positive and productive and debatable afternoon. Thank you. And now I'll welcome Anna Cutler, Director of Tate.
That's the windows. And they're letting in and out air. So the hotter you get, the more they'll open. So don't get hot. I've got 5 minutes, but Leslie's been very clear with me that it will only be 5 minutes. So I'm going to keep this as short as possible. In being asked to do this, one of the things that was in the language that got used was, you know, what would, in answering or presenting a provocation, what would we want for arts and craft and design education in the future? And so I've got a little bit obsessed about two words, which are for and to. And that actually, if we look at it at a responsibility for this, then it's a very totalising concept, and actually what we do is take away agency. And I think perhaps for me this has something to do with the difference between the educative and learning, concepts of the educative and the concepts of learning, in which actually we kind of make a decision for and on behalf of others in a way that actually comes from all our perspectives, professionalism and experience, so I don't want to get rid of that, but it does also just present a one-way street where people can come along with us if they choose, or just to tolerate it if they have to. So I'm quite interested in thinking about what if we were responsible to the idea of art and design education? What if we were responsible to children and young people, and what if we were responsible to what that means? And that immediately sets up some sort of dialogue that you have to have, and some sort of responsibility to the idea, which gives a bit of agency to oneself to be able to know what you can do in that arena. I mean, I do go to bed at night feeling responsible for, you know, people around the world, and that's completely useless. And actually, to understand one's role in what you can do from the position you're in, I think would be really much more, would give much more agency, but it also enables other people to have theirs. And in thinking about that, which is actually what the word responsible means, which is to respond to, a kind of call and response, I think we actually might have a better conversation where we recognise that we might need to change what we think and what we know and how we go about things and what we really think would be the right things for them that receive. So I'm kind of interested in that and how far that goes, and maybe some of that is misguided, but I'm interested that it's made me think differently about how I think about what we might provide for them. And really, that now goes alongside the research. So what kind of research would we need to do to make that an authentic conversation? So it clearly has to be something that really genuinely has an open-ended question. But I really want to ask, who's asking the questions? What lens are they looking through? You know, what's their cultural perspective? You know, all the kind of race and gender things. Who are we asking? Who are we asking it of? Are we asking children? Are we asking the profession? What do we want? What do we want to learn? Why do we want to learn it? Who wants to learn what? What do we want to know, and why do we want to know it? So just a few questions to get us going. So I recognise that that's a, you know, but that's, I think it's complex, but I also think that that needs to be an authentic place to be, and not to find things that we then fit in to our structures and systems which themselves don't work. And I know that's a massive ask. And in fact, just to end, to say that I spoke to, I was in a conversation with Graham Donaldson, who did the review, the curriculum review for Wales. And he did that. He kind of made sure he did research with families, communities, schools, teachers. They often don't get asked, you know, what do we think we might be doing? And they all responded. And then he was really, I think he was really anxious that nothing would happen, because what was missing was the translation. And the act of translation between what the idea was and what everybody wanted, and how you make that happen in schools, or how you make that happen in the profession. And I think that's possibly, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, obviously. You know, we need to gather some good information, but also we need to look back, see what's already out there, see what worked, what didn't. We need to kind of have an intelligent overview, but I really think we possibly need to attend to the translation into practice and how we get there, which is something we tend not to do.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Mark Londonsborough, Associate Director, Creative Learning and Development, the Royal Society of Arts, London.
I wasn't going to stand, but Anna set the tone now. So I suppose a couple of things. For me, when I first got the question, I thought that it seems that the next 3 years are ones that are particularly full of uncertainty in terms of the education system and in terms of what we're going to need and what we're going to be experiencing in the country. And I thought that in terms, also thinking in relation to the education system and arts and culture and arts and design and education, I think that one of the things that we do have that we can be really certain about is the quality of HE in arts and culture and design, and about its contribution to the economy and contribution to how we're perceived overseas, and our ability to make networks and to stay integrated with collaborators and researchers and artists and talented people from across the world. And I think that that's something which at the moment feels like it's both got a bit of an uncertain future, but is also critical to helping us negotiate that uncertain future over the next few years. But I'm not going to talk too much about that. I think partly because I suppose the RSA's particularly interested in art and design and cultural learning more broadly in schools at the moment. And I think that they're also facing an uncertain future, threatened by sort of increasingly narrow accountability frameworks and a sort of decline in the amount of teacher expertise that we're seeing, and the amount of teacher training time given over to learning and training in arts and design, and the numbers of specialist teachers dropping off a cliff. So I think that in terms of research and evidence and how they might help us negotiate this, I suppose our interest is threefold. I think the first is about building the evidence base, and I think our big project at the moment is working with the Education Endowment Foundation. Over the next 3 years, we'll be trialling and running tests on arts and cultural activities in schools, and looking at their impact on non-cognitive development, so that's kind of soft skill development, but also on attainment. And I think that that's part of our interest, is looking at the instrumental value of arts and design and cultural learning in schools, but it's not the sum total of our interest. And I think that I suppose that interest is responsive to the fact that lots of people, lots of practitioners do feel like that learning in and through the arts can have an impact on children's literacy and their numeracy, and can have an impact on their motivation to learn and their resilience and their autonomy in the classroom. And so we're really interested to know that if those claims are being made, to know how much they're doing those things, and to try and understand how effective they're being in those things. But I don't think it's just about instrumentality, and I think this is one of the things that we're particularly interested to work with the sector on, is to kind of understand how people understand research and evidence and how they relate to it. It feels to me that a lot of people in the sector feel a little bit anxious about the idea of evidencing practice and researching practice, that evidence always means impact evaluation. It doesn't mean necessarily knowing and understanding what we do better and being able to make decisions about the choices we make in the programs that we design. I think the next thing is about building our capacity for self-improvement. And I think that we need to think about, I suppose, our models for innovation in cultural learning, and how new ideas take hold, and how we're developing new ideas and new programs of activity. And I wonder if actually this is something which is particularly interesting about art and design together, whether there's something that the art side of that can learn from the designer and their mode of innovation, and something that the designer can learn from the artist and their mode of innovation, and their ability to confound and surprise, as well as the designer's ability to be based in needs analysis and design for impact. I also think that, and this is akin to the, this is related to kind of building the evidence base. I think that it's important that the sector adopts a slightly more reflective and evidence-informed approach to educational practice. And I think that at the moment we feel a little bit like anything scientific, anything measurable, anything that's based in relation to impact assessment. Thanks, 1 minute. Impact assessment is going to set us up with some kind of more accountability hoops to jump through that neither we don't want, and that schools and teachers really don't need any more of. But I think that there's something to be said for thinking about how reflective practice and scientific practice and evidence-based practice can have something to offer each other. And then very finally, have I got 30 seconds? Brilliant. And I think the final thing is about improving our mechanisms for how we understand effective practice within our community, and how we are communicating that outside of the sector. And I think that it's really interesting to talk to colleagues where there's not much of a sense of consistency or coherence around what a developmental framework for children and young people learning in and through the arts might look like, or what we might hope to be they might achieve by the time they're done with their learning. Or how that might prepare them for life once they're finished formal education. And I think that knowing how we communicate that more effectively within our community of practice as well as outside of it is going to be critical.
Thank you very much. Do we have Catherine Pugh? Sorry, I know you were running late. Okay, thank you. Catherine Pugh, Head Teacher, St Marylebone School, London.
You can give me a late detention for my lateness, but I'll blame the traffic. So I was asked the question what I would like from art, craft and design education by 2020, and so this is the vision. I'd like it to be an uncompromised, high quality experience in every young person's schooling, in which young people are encouraged to experience and value the pleasure of process, the messiness of making, the rewards of refining, redoing and remaking, the things made possible by science and technology, and that it is human imagination, dedication and application that enable that technology in the first place. I want to see, as I am very lucky enough to see at our school now, students practicing self-discipline along with technical skill alongside creative risk-taking, asking how and what if, and being given the chance to find out the answer. I'd like their learning and achievement to be acknowledged, yes, by rigorous but meaningful assessment, which merits creative thinking, practical skill, the ability to plan, think, make, refine, present, evaluate at a high level, worthy of grades in the same way as other disciplines are. However, there are some problems which threaten the realisation of this. Problem one is, I'm sure, familiar to you all, which is where arts are seen as soft skills lacking rigour, things that happen around the periphery of real work. This problem leads to several others, such as problem two, in which the assessment of these subjects either becomes dominated by a written examination as opposed to practical, portfolio, product, presentation, in order to justify or over-justify, in my view, the academic value, or assessment becomes reduced to a less robust certification, which suggests that the subject is indeed less valuable. This means that the need to justify the arts results in painful frameworks which, for example, aim to measure creativity. This is all in the context of problem four, which is the sound and fury of the EBAC, signifying, as Macbeth said, nothing, and associated pressures on schools to perform in some subjects over others. I'm happy to take questions on the EBAC, because I'm not actually anti-EBAC, but it's just in the context of that. Problem five is, this leads to problem five, which is where school leaders are under chronic, and I mean chronic, financial constraint, plus the pressure to perform under new accountability measures, do not invest in those subject areas, which leads to problem six, which Mark alluded to, where great teachers in these subjects become isolated, dejected, sidelined in their schools, or worse, increasingly, schools can't afford to hire them, and so arts education in schools becomes meagre and mediocre. Where research and evaluation can help with this is, firstly, in supporting robust and meaningful ways to assess learning in these subjects in a way which merits the creative skill, the higher order thinking, the ability and application of students. Secondly, it could help in showing how teachers, the professionals, can be trained and then trusted to teach, assess, moderate, examine. Thirdly, it needs to have the courage to examine the behaviours and attitudes in and around education which have led to the denigration of these subjects, and to encourage the arts community to have intelligent self-respect in the way it fights its corner. Fourthly, research and evaluation needs somehow to re-examine what the point of school really is, in order to dispel and destroy what I see as problem 7, which sums up the overarching error in education thinking, in which schools are seen as production lines where young people can be taught and told things which will make them into perfect employment-ready little robots. This is not the point of school, and it's certainly not the point of arts, craft and design education.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Peter Gregory, Principal Lecturer, Teaching and Learning at Canterbury Christ Church University and President of NSEAD.
I'm very, very pleased that Catherine went before me, because I can continue the line of thinking rather than stating it in the first place. Can I also apologise if you have a sore bottom? You're sitting on 3 pieces of graded paper. They're mine. I'd like you to be aware of the fact I want to talk about 3 grades of provocation. So if you'd like to look at them and establish in your own mind which is the gentlest, because I'm going to start with that. Okay, so that should take you to the fine graded sandpaper, which says 120 on the back. It won't take me long to talk about the general process of celebration, which I think is what the fine graded sandpaper is for. It's about the final leg of preparation when you want to varnish or you want to repaint an object. The problem is that there is so much, I think, that lies beneath the surface as far as research and also initial teacher education is concerned. And I'm concerned, as will become clear as we talk through, that what we're talking about now is actually the product of 5 or 10 years of work, which has not been identified carefully enough already. So by the time we get to the coarse sandpaper, you're going to get some idea of just how deep we're going to remove some of those paint layers. And the pack of sandpaper that I bought on Saturdays told me that it's dangerous to sand leaded paint. So we could be talking about old material that we're taking off here. I'm especially happy to say that I think the celebration end of this provocation is about everything Catherine has said that we believe is good quality art, craft and design education. Whether that's the right title or not, I'm going to leave to one side, because I'm aware of the fact if we would travel back in time, drawing to the Victorians does not mean what it does to us in school today. So there are a whole host of things around how we package a subject and what we call it. But it's because of lack of preparation for the earlier levels that I really wanted to go straight into the medium course, the medium sandpaper. That's number 80 if you need the tactile reminder. And actually there are lots of things that I don't know. That sounds a true academic statement. You know what you don't know, but actually when you start thinking about what you do know, you realise just how vast the universe is of what you don't, and the reasons why. So in terms of the additional work that I think we ought to be concentrating on in terms of preparation, from today, or indeed from next year, assuming that we're very successful in the next 12 months, I'd like to see a whole host of collaborations taking place between the agencies, the different organisations, the cultural sector, but especially with schools. And by schools, I don't just mean the head teachers, nor indeed governors, though they're important, nor indeed trustees or members. And if you don't understand the changing landscape in education, there are major changes taking place around us which we can't predict what will happen. We have, as was already reminded us, evidence that teachers have insufficient training once they're qualified. The issue that I want to raise, and I'm beginning to itch to get to that course sandpaper now, is what we're doing for the teachers who are being trained today. In terms of the future, they will be affecting the next 5-10 years with immediate effect as they qualify. And some of the things that I would like to say about 5 or 10 years ago for training of teachers has not yet really taken shape. So I'd like to see a greater awareness of joint projects, and I'm very pleased to see the joint publication working with school governors outside on the stall as I came in. If you've not seen it, please do look at it, and please make sure all school governors that you're aware of have seen it, because it's something all too easily that school governors miss. They don't understand the importance of this subject that we're calling art and design now within the curriculum. And because they don't understand it and they hear central government talking about other subjects, which I've very biased, I'm going to say aren't anything like as important as art and design, all of those start to build up the impression that it's not important. So, the course sandpaper. I've probably got more down on here than I have for anything else, but this is revelation as far as I'm concerned. It's about revealing what's beneath the surface. And the problem is we don't know what's under the surface. From a research point of view, and I've already alluded to this, there is precious little evidence of what's actually going on inside classrooms in the subject of art and design. I can think of one article written recently in the last 5 years around primary art and design inside the classroom, and I can think of maybe 4 written in secondary, but in terms of giving an overall picture, that's not very good. In fact, what ended up happening in the academic world was an over-reliance on the Ofsted reports, the subject survey reports. The last one of those was published in 2012 and said that 50% of secondary schools did not teach the subject well enough. It also said the majority of primary schools, I'll repeat that, the majority of primary schools did not teach the subject well enough. And you'll remember the national outcry and how everything happened in the local in the national press. It was very quiet. We have not dealt with the issue of it was bad then. Will it have got better since? I'm going to stick my neck right out and say I can't see anything on the horizon or looking back over the last 5 years that will have changed that. In fact, recently I had to do a presentation around primary ITE, primary initial teacher education, and discovered that there was precious little research on that as far as art and design was concerned. So I looked back 20 years and found some very interesting pieces of work that I could then build from. Part of our problem, and if you're not involved in teacher education, you may not know this, but there are now so many different routes into education, into teacher training, that we have an issue of time. How much time is allocated? How many minutes do you think it takes to train an art teacher? As far as the survey that I undertook was concerned, there were some providers that were thinking 90 minutes was sufficient. That's across the whole of their primary training over 3 years. That might explain why we're looking at what we're looking at. As far as secondary is concerned, the pressures are very similar, but perhaps not quite so pressing. And therefore, I'm going to say not quite so urgent, but they are still really important. The very last thing I want to say is that, I mentioned Ofsted have stopped doing the survey reports, so there is now no one telling us what's going on in schools. We are now reliant on a whole host of other things, including trying to dig out from data, attainment data, exactly what is happening at secondary level and the impact that that's having on the future. So you'll be aware, if you've looked at the NSEAD survey, the notion of a pipeline is very, very much in our minds. What has happened before affects what happens afterwards. So some of the things that I've heard so far, I would have been really, really excited to have heard 5 or 10 years ago. Now we may need to be a bit more radical in what we do to attack the present position. And then lastly, if you've been trained for 90 minutes and you have no CPD to follow in your career, it's hardly surprising that you end up with teachers who really don't know what to do with their subject, or hide within a very selective system whereby they train students for exams in order to pass and collect the medals, as Catherine was suggesting. But all of that is that very coarse sandpaper, and I hope it wasn't too painful, but I think unless we deal with some of those issues, we will not get to the areas of celebration. Thank you.
Finally, Sir Nicholas Sirota, Director of Tate, Chair of Arts Council England and Patron of NSEAD.
I guess I should stand and begin with an apology and thanks to Anna, because I was delayed for coming first rather than last. It's not a bad idea to have the Director of Education and Learning at the Tate coming first, and it's perhaps not a bad idea to have the incoming Chairman of the Arts Council coming last. I'm going to take issue in a way with the initial question, because I think, not surprisingly, given the people who posed it, it's overambitious. I see no possibility of having a really significant change in what art, craft and design education looks like in 2020, given that we're already in 2017. And I have my sights set on 2025 or 2030, because I think it's a long-term game. At the Arts Council, I've recently become chair, and I'm in the very, very fortunate position of having alongside me Darren Henley as chief executive, who, as many of you will know, wrote 2 reports on cultural education for the government in 2011 and 2012. And they form the basis of a lot of very, very good thinking about the arts in education. Very few of his recommendations have been fully implemented, so there is still a great deal to be done. Darren, however, has initiated the beginning of a new project which will take some time to develop, which is to create a 25-year talent plan for people working, developing their skills, education, and practice in the arts, and setting out the contribution that that can make to the community and to society in general. And that process will develop over the next 3 or 4 years. And in parallel with that, I have announced that the Arts Council, together with Durham University, is going to establish a commission in the autumn that will work for about 18 months, looking at the questions in a way that are being posed today. That commission, which takes unashamedly as its model the Warwick Commission that was that ran 3 or 4 years ago, is really intended to put some flesh on the bones of what the Arts Council itself believes very strongly in a cultural education for young people. As many of you in this room will be aware, the Arts Council has 5 principal goals as its strategy for the period 2010 to 2020. And one of those is improving the cultural education and engagement of young people in the arts. In September, the Arts Council will begin to formulate its strategy for the period 2020 to 2030. And young people are clearly going to play a major part in that. And I've suggested creating this Durham Commission because there has been an enormous amount of heat on the subject of the arts in schools and cultural education. Many of the people in this room have fought battles. Catherine referred to the EBAC, and a great deal of the focus of those battles has been on the issue of EBAC and the impact of that on arts education in schools. It's perfectly plain that the current administration, it may change of course after the 8th of June, but the current administration is not going to change its position on the EBAC at present. And I feel that we need to step back and move away from talking just about the EBAC to think about the whole question of the right of young people to a broad education, and in particular, obviously, an education in art and design. So the Commission will look at present practice in schools, HE and universities. It will look back over what has been achieved in the last 15 or 20 years, probably beginning with creative partnerships, but also looking carefully at what has been done with ArtsMark, music education hubs, the Sorrel Foundation, Saturday morning clubs. There are a whole range of initiatives that have been taken in the field of the arts and education over the last 15 years, most of which have been a response to one individual's passion. The case of the music education hubs, it's as much to do with the fact that fortunately the wife of the Secretary of State at the time was a violin teacher, so a lot of money was found for teaching musical instruments, training people to play musical instruments. There are a whole range of things that have been done, but they've all been piecemeal. What I want Durham to do is to look at the practice over the last 15 years. I want Durham to bring together all the research that has been done in this field, adding to it, of course, the work that the RSA is currently doing. I want them to suggest a framework for a cultural education program that would be available to all pupils. It's interesting that in Wales, with a separate government, the arts are part of the education curriculum. In England, it's not. Do they know something we don't know? Do we not know something that they do know? I want to look at the research, both as was characterized a moment ago, for its instrumental value, but also for its intrinsic value of the arts. We cannot simply be teaching people art and education so that they become great scientists, although I do hope great scientists will have an art and design education. And I want the Durham Commission to make some recommendations about the framework within all which happens and then the practice. But I want it to do so from a non-party political point of view, insofar as that's possible. And I would like the Commission, if it does nothing else, probably insofar as it's party pre, to endorse many of the things that Catherine Pugh just laid before you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our presenters, to Nick, to Anna, to Mark, to Kat, and to Peter for really sort of setting the scene for what I hope is going to be a very productive afternoon. So I'll hand over now to Emily for questions and answers.
Great. So, has anyone got a pressing question? We've got about 20 minutes for any of the speakers. Yes. Oh, and can I ask that you speak in, we've got roving mics, and if you can speak into those, because this is being recorded.
Yes, I have a question for Sir Nicholas Rota. I appreciate we were looking at initiatives, or you will be looking at initiatives which extend within the curriculum and beyond. I would encourage or hope that the Commission does look at the curriculum, or perhaps lack of curriculum. Our patron, Sir John Sorrell, the Saturday Hubs, we totally congratulate everything that they do. We support everything they do, but they happen on Saturday and they're not for the majority of students for which you referred. So is there anything that the Commission can do to look at changes to the curriculum and the impact of the curriculum on our young people?
Well, I think it would be very surprising if the Commission didn't look at the curriculum. I agree with you that we shouldn't be in a position where the principal access to an art and design education for 16 to 18-year-olds is in the limited number, although growing number, of towns and cities that John Sorrell's Foundation is able to provide access to certain art schools and universities. And while it's a completely brilliant scheme, and I think there are all kinds of things that can be learned from it, it shouldn't be as necessarily limited as it is.
If you wouldn't mind also saying who you are just before you ask the question.
Thank you. Laura Ganderhow from Arts Council. Just in review to Durham, but also wider actually, it's about how the degree to which we're going to engage and ask young people what they actually think, and all kinds of young people. So I think piecemeal was the word earlier we used, and I think we asked certain groups of young people certain questions, but we very rarely engaged with the disengaged and less culturally literate young people. So it's how we can actually start to know what young people want, actually.
So does someone, I mean, Nick, you can respond, but does someone else also have a thought? Mark, would you?
We are talking to, I mean, I think through the programme that we're doing with Education Endowment Foundation, we're not only interested in kind of looking at measuring the impacts, we're also interested in how programmes of work are delivered and how they're responded to in situ, and part of that is about working with and talking to children and teachers and artists and practitioners who are working with teachers in schools to look at how projects are implemented and how the processes work. So that's definitely part of our wider study. But I also think that I suppose there's sort of a bit of a circular thing which comes back to if and responding to what Nick was saying about the about kind of frameworks that stretch across arts and cultural learning, that if we're not certain what it is that we think young people should be developing, I suppose that sort of informs or doesn't inform the questions that we might ask them about what they think might be important. So I think we need maybe we need a kind of straw man to kind of take to young people to say, we might think that we sort of think that these are things are important. So what do you think? And what are we missing more than let's just open the floor out?
I'll just say something briefly about student voice. Asking the opinions of young people is really important. It informs a lot of our school self-improvement. And it takes consideration, as I'm sure you practice anyway, in approaching young people in schools. But I would absolutely support it happening, because if I have to give the example of my school, because that's what I can talk about. But if somebody comes to visit St Marylebone and wants to know what it is that means the arts have remained so central to the love of learning that students at our school have, I've learned to stop talking about it and simply just take them into the rooms where they can see it happening. And I think that there's something about when you're working with young people in schools and visiting schools to collate that student voice, there is a role to be played with working with staff to have the courage to stop pointing at a piece of paper or finding words for it themselves, but just walk into the, I mean, I'm going to be careful because my head of art's out there somewhere, but I would just take people into the rooms to see it happening in practice. I'm not an academic, so I don't know how rigorous a research method that would be, but there's huge merit in getting young people to show, demonstrate, articulate that, and that will add to their sense of the value of their subject because they're being asked to talk about it so there's a part, I guess what I'm saying is the process of asking them helps to validate that they're being asked about their education in the art room as much as anywhere else.
Can I just say something quickly as the mic goes back? Sorry. I had a really amazing moment once when I got asked what was children's favourite piece of work at Tate, and we had loads of kids who were working with. So I asked them, and they said one of the Bacon triptychs, which are dark, and they were 7-year-old kids and complex and very interesting. And it was to a journalist, and it came out that it was Matisse's Snail. Now, I've no doubt they do love Matisse's Snail, but it's not what they said. And I think there is an act of translation on behalf of children and their thinking that diminishes them. And it kind of makes me a bit angry, and I'm feeling a bit angry going, every time we speak on behalf of others, we do something not so great. and so how do we make sure we try not to do that, and how do we open up a dialogue that gives that we have to rise to the expectations of us in this.
I just wondered whether I could ask Mark one question, which is, you're undertaking this research through the RSA into the impact of the arts and cultural learning in schools. And this has been funded by government and very much an initiative from number 10 Downing Street, as I understand it. Is that correct? 11. Number 11. All right, number 11. I wonder, is this one of a number of studies that are taking place? Are equivalent studies being undertaken in the fields of mathematics, history, geography, and other subjects, or is this a study in the arts alone? And if it's in the arts alone, is that because there's a feeling that there's a need to explain the value of the arts in a particular way that's different from other disciplines? I just wonder why the arts have been singled out in this way.
I can definitely respond to that. I suppose they haven't, is the straightforward answer. The Education Endowment Foundation was set up as a result of, after the introduction of the pupil premium, and as a mechanism to try and understand the impact of any kinds of interventions and activities which were designed to reduce the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers. And so their remit is to respond to where there is practice in the field, which is designed to do that. Initially, it was just to reduce the attainment gap, and increasingly, and I think that's something that we've been able to use a bit of leverage on in relation to this programme, is to look at not just attainment, but also the barriers to attainment, and also the enablers of attainment, which might not be about academic skills. They might be about other kinds of approaches and competencies, which they call non-cognitive skills or non-cognitive areas of development. And I think that our programme is I suppose, putting a couple of spanners into their usual ways of working, because a lot of the things that the programs that we are likely to be testing aren't necessarily only interested in developing children's attainment and improving their attainment. They're also interested in improving the way that they communicate, the way that they engage with one another, the way that they learn together as a class. And all of these things, I think the EF are revealing increasing enthusiasm for understanding those and the impact of those on children's outcomes in education. So I think that we're providing some useful pushback on the sort of the maybe fairly narrow starting points for the Education Endowment Foundation. But certainly this is unusual that they would be running these kind of tests in arts and cultural activities. It's the first time they've done it as a single fund. They have done some trials of activities here and there, but as a sort of as a study of 4 or 5 activities together, it's the first time they've done it. And most of what they test are maths interventions that are designed to improve maths, and English and writing interventions that are designed to improve English and writing, not things where there's some instrumental effect of one thing or another. And I think I suppose our interest and the reason why we started it was because it's not that that's the only thing that we or anybody else in the room thinks is the only thing that arts and cultural activity can do for children, but that lots of people are doing activities which they claim to be having impacts on children's literacy and numeracy and on their motivation and all those other things that I mentioned. So I think it's about saying, well, actually, if we are doing those things and we do think we're good at doing those things, let's really seek to understand how and why those things do work. And if we can get better at doing those things, if that's what we want to do, can we get better at doing those things through understanding what's happening in the classroom?
I'd just say something about the EF in terms of its baseline, because one of its strap lines is that it's out to prove what works or doesn't work in education. And it has already published an initial literature survey which proclaims that the arts do not raise attainment in children. So that is already published on their website as evidence. But I would also say that that report was rejected by the academic community and was not publishable within a journal that I'm aware of. So just to say that I think the EEF are using the opportunity to now test the backdrop to see whether that is the case.
I'm Lily Elms, I'm an artist, teacher and researcher. I was interested in a couple of points that were made there. Peter obviously mentioned the severe lack of research into arts education. I've been looking a lot at the fact that, teachers identifying as researchers is quite a new thing on the blog. And, I'm sort of part of that. And how can, my research that I'm doing and other teacher, educator, researchers, how can, any ideas on how our research can become more visible with regard to the cases being made, the acts of translation, the Durham Commission, how can that research, have to be sort of amplified as part of the case?
Yeah, I can say something. I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is looking at the local culture education partnerships and how if there are teachers, if a local area is lucky enough to have teachers in the arts who are interested in being researchers as well as teachers, I think that actually working together with a local community of practice and making sure that other people in your area know that that's happening and know and understand through you that research doesn't necessarily have to be about measuring impact on attainment, that it could be about knowing and understanding practice in ever more complex ways. I think that's something that you can do really quickly and actively locally.
Yeah, in terms of working with local communities, absolutely agree with that. I'll take it one stage further and say there are now growing networks of teachers across the country that are interested in promoting research. However, I want to differentiate between research and evaluation, just in case anyone's working particularly from the cultural sector and are used to evaluation reports. As far as publication within educational research journals, they're not likely to be accepted because there are too many unknowns. And I think that helps to explain something of the EEF's insistence on certain things to be put into place. The other thing to say is there's nothing stopping you from submitting articles to journals, and certainly over the last few years, the number one world ranking art education journal, which is published by NSEAD, happens to have seen a significant drop in UK-fueled research articles. So what we've seen is a growing number from abroad and a substantial reduction from the UK. So if that's a gauntlet to throw down for some people, that will be a very useful thing to do.
Hello, I've got a question for Mark regarding your discussion of the intersection between reflective, scientific and evidence-based research, on your interest in that. And I'm wondering what you think it looks like in terms of where we see allocation of funding at the moment towards STEM subjects and science. And if you go to the Science Museum, it's probably the most interactive, practice-based, involving museum for young people to get involved with. So if we were trying to look for an intersection of that, it's already out there, but then how do we therefore rebalance it towards practice-based or arts practice becoming important in that situation? What's your picture of it?
So I think probably I didn't articulate myself with much clarity earlier on, but I think that what I was really arguing for is that that rather than in terms of program design thinking about the intersection of arts practice and scientific practice, that actually it's more in our self-concept and about thinking of ourselves as practitioners as and having more of a scientific inquiry in about how we do that. And I think that and the reason why I was looking at it was I just kind of looked at the kind of, I suppose, the 5 key habits of scientific inquiry, and actually thinking about how much or how little intersection there is with how arts educators go about practice, and whether there might be areas within that we might think about strengthening. And some of them are really familiar. The first is observing over time. And I think we're really good at observing our practice and being able to kind of look at what's happening and being able to tell each other about what's happening. I think the next is about finding patterns and relationships, and actually as artists that feels like really familiar territory. Identifying and classifying, I think we're sort of there, but researching what's gone before and secondary sources of what's happened in relation to what you're doing, I think that's somewhere where we start to be less good. Certainly in terms of the applications we received from practitioners for the Education Endowment Foundation program, we had about 100 applications, and within that there were quite a lot of applications that were citing evidence of impact of things which had nothing to do with the way that their program was designed. And I think that as a sector we're quite in the habit of using evidence of some impact in arts education somewhere else to justify the fact that arts education exists at all, and to justify the decisions we make as program designers, even if that particular kind of impact or that particular kind of activity has very little to do with what we're doing. And so I think that it's partly about the kind of sort of knowing how to access that kind of research and knowing what to do with it once you've got it. And I suppose the last thing is about comparative and fair testing, and I think that's partly what we're doing with EEF. It's really difficult to do it at scale and to do it, as you say, in a way which satisfies the criteria of research journals. But actually I think in terms of doing comparative and fair testing of our work as practitioners on a small scale, I think that we probably could do better at kind of figuring out how to do that in a way which is much more convenient to us as practitioners, as teachers in a school, and do that in a way which isn't necessarily about satisfying research journals, but which actually serves to empower a more reflective practice which is focused on the difference that we're making to children's lives. So.
I saw you nodding. Do you
Did I nod out? Sorry, no, I don't.
Hi, Helen Charman, Director of Learning and Research at the Design Museum. So it's a question for Nick about the Durham Commission. Where are you conflating disciplinary approaches conceptually and methodologically? We've got art, craft, design. They are distinctive. They're not entirely typologically separate, but the language that one might encounter in design education would be more around iteration, user-centered design, feedback loops, impact understood in quite a different way. And I think this is an interesting level of complexity for the Commission. So my question is, how, at early stages, how might the Commission best engage with these distinctiveness across subjects and ways of working? And then how might the Commission then better inform other subject areas, for example, design and technology, in a curriculum context where these subjects are siloed, and yet often the approaches have a lot to learn from each other. It's an interdisciplinary approach rather than a curriculum-specific approach I think we need.
I mean, if we do well, we'll have people on the Commission who understand exactly what you've just set out, and will themselves have experience of working in design, in technology, and in the visual arts as such. It would be a mistake if it simply became fine art. It certainly is not intended to be a commission that looks only at fine art practice, whatever that might be these days, because it must necessarily also engage with performance, film, photography, a whole range of media. Okay.
Hello, Nick Addison, University of the Arts, London. This might be a question for Nick Sorota, but maybe others as well. It seems to me that one of the problems is the actual terms on which we are engaging with the notion of testing. If the curriculum is going to be looked at, is the assessment system going to be looked at too? Because it seems to me that this is the thing that constrains and distorts. Just to give you an example, I recently heard of an art and design teacher, Key Stage 3, who was asked to model an outcome for a Year 8 class. Now, in itself, that might seem absurd. Not only, however, was he asked to, and this was he, asked to design an outcome, he had to design 3. An outcome indicative of an A, an outcome. So this adult was meant to be able to imitate a 13-year-old's production at 3 levels. What is going on? And if the absurdity of those sorts of processes was known, then maybe something could be done about it. So the terms on which people are being assessed is absurd.
Right, over to you guys. Yeah.
I think the issue is one of pedagogy, the actual process of teaching and learning, and a misunderstanding of the peculiarities of the subject that we're describing. So what you have just described, I think, is quite common in many other subjects, and often school leaders simply translate that and apply it to the subject that we might call art and design at present. But I think the other thing... Yeah. But in terms of the Commission, if I can sort of half answer the question and suggest that the Commission looks at the curriculum, perhaps to take the UNESCO definition of the curriculum rather than just being around the paper documents produced by government, to actually look at the learned curriculum or the experienced curriculum as part of that process. So that would encompass the things we've said about listening to youngsters, but also to be aware of the fact that sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And if I give you an example of that, working with student teachers, I used to ask the question when they first came back from placement in school, did you see any art being taught? I learnt the answer, whatever it was that they gave, told me more about their assumptions about the subject than what they saw. In other words, if they had not got a good understanding of the breadth of the subject, they would probably say, no, I only saw X or Y, whereas X or Y might have been part of the experience of an art curriculum, but they didn't make the connection. Similarly, they may have not seen any art, but they were told by the school it was. It involved the use of colour or paint or something that perhaps someone else said was art. So there are a whole host of things around pedagogy, which is exactly why I think we are lacking in understanding what goes on in school at present.
It's really hard to know where to start. I feel very strongly that there ought to be rigorous assessment in all subjects, especially if the subject's going to be able to feel that they can stand up alongside each other. So precisely how that's going to work subject by subject, so I don't know how many. For me, I think there are 3 subjects up there. That's just how we organise our curriculum. I feel quite strongly that I'm just going to use the word arts to cover the multitude of subjects we're talking about, and I'm got drama and dance in my head as well. I feel very strongly that we ought to be able to devise an assessment system which does merit what students are able to demonstrate in practical ways, that is not a dumbed down version of what they do in other subjects which are assessed in written pieces of work. And I don't mean that means all of art is assessed by portfolio and product, but I do fear the increasing ground being gained by written terminal examination, as if that is the only way to test aptitude and ability. It works in some places. I'm sure there is a way to do it, partly because I see it in our school, and it's certainly an important life lesson, because increasingly in schools today, the subjects where that learning from process, redoing, remaking, reviewing, as I mentioned before, the only subjects where that is becoming possible is actually in the arts subjects, because they have to devise a piece of drama, rehearse, redo, re-perform, and the same in the other arts subjects. Those, as we all know, because we're working professionals, is what you do in a lot of professional life, not just be tested on things in an exam. I think there's a place for examinations, and I thank you for answering. It is on pedagogy, because there are areas of the curriculum where demonstrating what part of an A grade answer might look like, what part of a C grade answer might look like, and what an E grade answer might look like, can be particularly effective. Whether it works or not in an art classroom, I'll defer to the subject specialists on that. I hope that made sense.
Piotr Biankowski from Nowhere in Particular. We seem to have got involved in a discussion mostly about assessment, and I wanted to bring my question back into whether and how research can actually influence practice, influence new practice or next practice. For a long time I've been very sceptical about whether this can happen, and my question to the panel is whether we should consider more the audiences for different types of research, and therefore whether and how it can influence practice. Off the top of my head, the normal audiences for research are there can be a political audience, there may be an academic audience, or there is an audience of practitioners. It's very rare that a single piece of research will address the needs of all 3 audiences, and in fact the acts of translation to turn that research to be understandable to all 3 audiences are considerable. I've always been most interested in the impact on practitioners, and I think there are huge gulfs normally between the research that is being done and making it accessible and understandable to practitioners and them actually having the time to implement it. But I think dividing research into different audiences may be part of the trick. And I wondered what the panel thought about that.
I think I've been very interested in everything from what we really mean by rigorous to what end are we talking about. I'm not sure I know what the purpose is or the end game is for either the children or the research. What I think I am interested in thinking through and hearing what people have to say is, I think we try to do way too much with pieces of research and with evaluation, and in fact there are approaches which I feel in the arts always try to have some sort of silver bullet or solve everything, which it absolutely won't. And everything is incredibly complicated, and that's what research just exposes, is that you have 26 children, if you're lucky, in a room and not more, and each one of those has got up with a different feeling and thought and place to start every single day. Go measure that. So how do you put them all in a Petri dish and you go, yeah, well, they're all right then. Do you not give some children something? The ethics of this are a huge issue, and so it's not simple. And I think that I think maybe we need to be, I kind of want to go, should we try something? Is there a space where we should be putting more speculative research that does try to look at things, that takes a few gambles, that could be, that doesn't have to be a publication through your peers. And we know that publications have reduced massively to mainstream thinking. If you want to get an article about your little thing, where do you put it these days? It's really complex. So I think I have no answer, but I have a lot of questions about how we might go about this, to what end, what are we trying to do, and for whom. And I think that actually, that's quite exciting, really. There are a lot of things to think about. But I do feel that we have had a certain kind of type of language in the room today, and I kind of go, I wonder whether it has to be this way. I wonder whether we always have to, talk about what is. Can we ever talk about what if? And maybe if we can't, then I have to question what the point of research is if it cannot change the way we think and do things.
Thank you. I'm going to call this session to a close on that. So if we dwell on the what ifs, there's coffee outside. We're due to reconvene actually at 10 past, but maybe at 15:15. Can I ask that you go and join one of the tables in the space outside? So there are 8 tables out there, and if you can kind of group yourselves by 15:15, and then we'll start the task, which is to have discussions on the tables for ourselves to address the 2 questions. What do we think art and design should look like in 2020, and what research and evaluation do we need? Very good. Thank you very much.